Hello, welcome. My name's Rowan, and I am going to walk through uh, the tech stack that we have learned in a course called Computer Science 5610, which is a web development course. I'm going to use this flow chart here. I have, for the most part, already laid out a lot of the concepts I'm going to discuss. I hope that is okay. I was going to do it while I talked, but I realized that it was taking entirely too much time to lay everything out and type and move it all, etc. So the way that I am going to do this, rather than one big flow chart, I decided to sort of break it down between the projects that we've worked on to point out at which points we have used or I have used the specific learnings of the course. I won't point out every time that I have used it, but just an example. And project one, I'll focus on HTML, CSS, and front-end JavaScript. That was very brief for the project. So focusing on the client browser, so two-tier, and the HTTP server. Project two, I'll discuss more backend stuff in terms of Express, server, connections to databases, etc., that bridge with MongoDB, and then I'll do a deep dive on MongoDB. All right, let's get started here. So, HTML. HTML is our content and our structure of a web page. It includes both visible and invisible content. And so the invisible content is in our HTML what we call the head of our HTML. And that includes some things that I've linked here. We've got, there's a space for title, author, description. We have we call it metadata, data about data essentially, but it's basically all this information that the browser and the web can use to find whatever website we're looking for. And we also link in our stylings or CSS or Bootstrap up top in the head of the HTML file. Now, keep in mind, as I said, this is all invisible, so I don't have a great example of what that looks like, right? Because we can't see it. But I did point here to the top, very, very top of the browser to sort of indicate that we are thinking about the engine, the browser, etc. Okay, so that's the head. The visible part of the HTML, we call that the body, and there's lots of different parts to the visible content because that is what HTML is used for mostly, is right, our visible content of what we can style and organize, etc. On something like this web page. So some parts of that, we have various types of elements inside the visible content or body that we can display using HTML. Some of those here, let's start with headings. We've got various sizes of headings. We can tag them H1 to H6, H1 being the largest, H6 being the smallest. Every page should only have one H1, one main heading. So my example of that is the H1 heading I actually have in the header of every page on my personal website. It has just my name here. That is an H1 header. So I pointed to that. I also pointed over here to the Hi, I'm Rowan. That's an H2 to point out another one. And the technical skills, I believe, is a H3. So those are all headings. We have semantic tags to really point out what all of these things are to keep ourselves really organize our visible content, etc. So like header, footer, main, nav, section. So this over here is a header. There's a footer on this site, right, with some links and a back to top button. That helps us keep organized. This whole bar, the header also includes, I use nav to like keep the navigation organized. But anyway, those are elements that we use in web development. We've got things called attributes that we put inside of our tags. IDs are classes that we can then reference later with like the CSS or the JavaScript to then change these things on the DOM or the domain object manipulation access, basically. IDs we use if we want something to be unique. An example of that is this avatar. I used an ID for profile picture to be able to change that and only change that because it flips between this and that. I'll talk about that more later with JavaScript. But then classes are reusable if we want to continue to use them. We'll add those attributes to be tagged and use again and again. An example of that down here is we've got this grid system of education and hobbies, and they look exactly the same because I ended up reusing it. Another element that we have is images using the IMG. An example of that here is all the images I used for the tech skills. Those are images. Links, if I were to, connect that all the way over to the navigation bar with home, about, projects, contents, those are all examples of links to link to the other pages. And in order to do that, we use a inside of our brackets. Text. So these are all forms of text elements that we can then use inside the body of the HTML. So paragraph is an example that I use both up here for the shorter bio and the longer bio. We just use a P for that. Another example is lists, which are pretty cool to use. I don't have an example to point out to you here as I do this flowchart, but I wanted to include them. So we've got unordered list, like a bullet point list, an ordered list, which would have numbers. And inside of those elements, we then use an LI, which is a listed item, to signify all of the different listed items. All right, last thing here to talk about is that our visible content, we also have some generic containers that we can use. Generic containers help us, stay organized. Some examples of that are divs and spans. Spans are inline for this. I use divs, which are big blocks, pretty generic big blocks. So really helpful, but at the end of the day, we also want to be using semantic tags to keep track of everything and keep it organized. All right, so we've talked about HTML. Now I'm going to talk about CSS. So we learned that in conjunction with HTML. So CSS is basically the presentation of the content. So it controls what things look like, adding color, fonts, spacing, overall layout, right? HTML is what's on the page, but CSS really defines what it feels like and looks like. So I've already added a bunch of things to mention about CSS here, and as I talk, I may add or move some stuff around, but let's go ahead and do it. So CSS, right? Layout, style, etc. All the things that fall under that bracket. So I have CSS here. All of the green ones are associated with the CSS, and I point to some things from Project 1 to highlight an example. So CSS. CSS, let's see, it has a bunch of different properties that we can then apply to the HTML. And the way that we apply those properties to the HTML is by using selectors. So we talked a little bit about classes and IDs from the HTML, but we've got our classes and IDs where we can, within the tags of the HTML, give things names. The classes are things that we want to reuse multiple times. The IDs are things that are unique we don't want to reuse. So here, for example, class, we have card and card image. From the project, I made these cards for education and hobbies and whatnot, a class of card that allowed for there to be consistent layout and display of different components of my website, but that I wanted to match and look cohesive. So the education cards and the hobby cards. So the class.card is the light blue card, and then the dot card image, for example, in the CSS can be used to then style the image that is then on the card. So that's kind of an example of how we can have multiple classes that kind of apply to the same thing. An ID, as I mentioned before, I did the profile pic or avatar. So that is something that if you want it to be unique in your website, then you can use an ID selector, and it sort of has more security around the use of it. Okay, so we've got our properties of CSS, and we can select the things we want to apply the style properties to based off of the selectors in the document that we then import by linking in the HTML document. So the properties that we can change, font, color, as you can see, I have a specific font here, different shades of blue, it's my favorite color, and then other properties that come up when we use something like the box model, which it is applicable. It's for both like HTML and CSS. It's kind of a shared thing. But the box model is something that every visible HTML element, like card, section, image, is basically treated like a bunch of boxes that are layered. And we use things like margin, padding, border, height, width to display that and be able to have a well-formatted visible web page, essentially. So an example of that here, right, is something like this card grid that I did. I already talked about how I could select these things to apply the CSS, but we select them, then we can apply the box model by things like the margin is the space in between the dot card, right? And then the padding is the space inside of the card so that the text isn't touching the direct edge of the card. And then in some cases, this we could add a border and height and width can be determined. Now in CSS, height and width, height and width can be directly specifically set with a certain like unit, like pixels. There's like various different types of units we can use. But another really cool, nifty thing that we can do in CSS is, we have these layout systems. And so something like Flexbot, box, or grid, or whatever, there's ways that we can use those to just keep things centered, keep them aligned. It allows for the page to be more responsive. So if I were to change in web development, like change the size of the window, which we're doing all the time these days with phones and different size computer screens and zooming in and out and whatnot, it dynamically will change the height and width of something to best fit the web page. Lastly, before we move on to JavaScript and the backend, Bootstrap is basically a CSS framework that we also learned about. I didn't use much of it in this project, but the example I do have is I do have this form that I added for folks to send me emails if they go to my personal site. So it's basically a already set up form that's like inline in HTML that you can plug in and end up with this like beautifully styled, already figured out layout. And so I wanted to give that a try. But this is an example of using Bootstrap, so it is like a CSS framework. All right, let's talk about JavaScript. So this will just be sort of an intro to JavaScript, before we really get into the back end in the next part. But JavaScript briefly used it in Project 1. I used it to swap the avatar image on my portfolio site. So that was my intro to JavaScript. My understanding is it is the most widely used programming language, which is actually pretty cool to now be using it. The benefits of JavaScript is it takes this website that is just a bunch of text and colors and stuff and makes it interactive. So JavaScript's really known for adding interactivity to a website, or like adding behavior to a website. So like switching the image if I hover over it and whatnot. So with JavaScript here, I put it all in these yellow diamonds. I will share this as well with the video to also allow you to have access to it to take a closer look. But anyway, so the yellow ones here, beginning of our JavaScript. So our JavaScript here in the middle. In this class, we have been using ES6 modules. ES6 modules is basically just a way for us to organize our JavaScript into various files and then import and export functions to be able to use, and it allows for it to be basically easier to maintain as it grows. This project, right, I just had the one simple thing. I called it avatar swap, I think, for a function to swap, but it was good practice for, or good practice / best practices as we move into bigger projects and into the job force. So that's why JavaScript, we use ES6 modules, import, export, keep things all tidy and organized. JavaScript, like any language, we've got our variables, we've got our constants, we have variables called lets. There's another one called vars, but we have been told not to use those, so avoid those at all costs. Some of the data types we've got arrays, objects, which have our key value pairs, and then our data types like strings, numbers, booleans, etc. Oh, I put array objects twice. Oopsies, but you get the point, right? A lot of it very similar to other programming languages if you are familiar. So we've got functions, programming language, we've got conditionals, we've got loops, for loops, while loops, ifs, else, etc. Oopsies. So, an example from this project is the avatar swap. So it originally starts with the blue behind, and then hovering over it, it switches it to the pink, which is actually a event listener, which is like a built-in method in JavaScript, which actually I forgot to put here. So maybe I will add this while I talk about it, but like an event listener. It's not really like a function, it's more like it's a built-in method, and because it calls back to a function. So the event listener would be like mouse enter, mouse leave or something, but it would then call avatar swap. So I think this makes the most sense here, and we'll just connect it to JavaScript. Okay, I think that is it, and let's talk more about the backend. All right, let's move on to discussing more of the things that I've learned in my web development course. So we're going to talk about the back end now, and things including more JavaScript stuff, Node, Express, and MongoDB. I organized this part into talking about the front end a little bit so we can look at the whole picture, the server part, and the database part. As I did before, I will mention the second project that I have worked on in this class, which is a web application called Freelance Flow to log projects and time worked for potentially a freelance employee. So I will connect some of that because that does have a database, and this in this example is an example of like a 3-tier architecture design. So, okay. So to get started here, I have a simplified version of the front end. We just went into tremendous detail about all the different things we can use on the front end for the client browser to allow things to happen on a web page. So that includes the HTML, the structure, CSS, the layout and design, and then the JavaScript on the front end. I talked about the example of the hover avatar, right, that switched back and forth. Basically, right, JavaScript accesses the document object model, the DOM. Mentioned it before, and handles like behavior and interactivity. And here it gets more interesting because the user, for an example, can add or update or delete a project. The fetch API, which I have right here in the light pink, sends that HTTP request to the server up here. Okay, so on like in this example here, I have our fetch API request connected down to the dashboard part of project 2. This is just like the user interface that the user is interacting with. And I connected the fetch API part there just to emphasize how the dashboard is fetching from the server and then the database information like the top 3 active projects with the closest deadline to the current date. So that is why that is connected there as an example. Okay, so talking about the server now, in this class we have worked with Node and Express. Node is just a framework so JavaScript can run outside of the browser. So I have a node there explaining that. So things like HTTP requests, files, and environments. Then we also have been using Express, and that provides the routes to get, post, put, and delete. So those are all the API routes here, get, post, put, delete. Connected those to my project page of this project just to emphasize this is a collection. I'll talk about that in a second, but a collection of projects that have all of those operations and being able to create a project, read a project, i.e. it adds puts, which is putting onto the list. Actually, no, that's updating, excuse me. Posting is adding it to the list. Put is updating it if we were to edit it and update it. And delete is being able to delete it from the list. The other thing that Express also uses to be like the bridge to our database is what we'd call middleware, which is kind of like a checkpoint or a filter for certain things, which is like sort of an added security benefit in certain cases. So it does like authentication. I have trouble saying that word, but like basically requiring understanding like who's logging in and managing those sessions, tracking the logged in users, all that good stuff. Handles the JSON parsing, etc. So that's kind of what the middleware is. So as I said, the Express connects to the database. So I have this pink tag here emphasizing our connection to our database. So our database here in this class, we've been using MongoDB. I will talk about Mongo in even more depth in the next section. But just to give you sort of a high-level, broad description of the database part here, right? MongoDB is just a company with software for people to create their own databases. So here, you know, I made a database inside MongoDB, so you actually create your own database. The database includes collections example collections just to have an example. I like examples, right? I included an image down here of the GUI backend, right? This is just so we can interact with it as humans, but thought it was better than nothing, but it shows some of the collections of projects, users, and time. We call each entry of those collections a document, and MongoDB uses JSON format, which is actually BSON format under the hood, meaning that it is actually binary. So those are the documents. What we see here in this image are the collections. If we were to click into this, you'd see the actual like JSON documents. And then the benefit of being able of using a database like this and having, instead of project 1, project 2, or 3 tiers, is being able to save things, use CRUD operations. These are like the built-in functions that we can use in the JavaScript in order to be able to do these things. But it allows that, like, you have your session, you can save those things. Over time, go in, edit, change, it continues to save it. So it's not a completely new I guess you can save your work, essentially, which I feel like we take for granted at this point, but that's pretty cool to be able to log into something, have it be secure, be able to look at some data, be able to update our data, be able to read our data, post our data, etc., delete our data, organize our data, and that's the benefit of using a database with a I guess our web technology or our web development compared to the last project. So to bring it back to think at the complete data flow here, a client server or client browser on the front end requests a fetch request. So something like post, so create, so that request, that fetch request, is then sent to the server where the Express server processes that request, uses the middleware to make sure that this is allowed to be happening before going into the database, parses the JSON stuff, then connects to the database to MongoDB. MongoDB then goes inside of your database, goes inside of your collections. Let's pretend we are posting a new project, goes into projects, adds a new document, as a JSON format, and then all of this stuff backtrack. Well, also right, the operation happens over here. So insert 1 would be the operation that actually handles inserting that document, and then it flows back to the document object model for the change to happen from our end, what we think is essentially instantly. Okay, let's move on and talk more about MongoDB. All right, so now we're going to talk about MongoDB, and that's what I'm going to do my deep dive on today. I had not worked with MongoDB until Project 2. I've worked with some NoSQL databases, and so it's really interesting for me to compare the two and to learn more about MongoDB. I also think it's really cool now to be able to connect MongoDB to a full stack app. Okay, so MongoDB, it is a documented oriented database. Which basically means that I don't know if MongoDB came up with it themselves. They're a company that came up with the software, but the data is held in what they call documents instead of tables, and they're JSON formatted. Under the hood, it's BSON, which is like binary JSON. I know I mentioned that before briefly in the other flowchart, but yeah, so binary JSON. This allows for speed and flexibility of it, and having been working with SQL databases, it's really interesting to see the difference, because there is truly a lot more flexibility with MongoDB databases and how we can use them. And I think that's very cool how we can update and edit our documents to include basically more components than they did before, or delete some of the components that we have as criteria in our documents, and collectively like a whole collection of data. Okay, so MongoDB is the pieces of it, really. The database, just the container for related collections. The software itself is through MongoDB, but then within that you make your own database. Within those databases you make groups of similar documents. So I've been talking about a lot like Project 2, but in this example, as we talk more and I do the coding example, we're going to talk about books. So you could think of like a collection of books, and then each document is information about one book. Each document is automatically signed an object ID, so that means that it's like a unique document and has a code to identify it. And then we've talked about it a lot, but the four main operations that can work are create, read, update, delete of these documents in a collection. Now, obviously we can filter and find documents. That's the coolness of a database. We can also like aggregate data together. It's just, that's a little bit more info on that. I'll show you that in a second. So an example like structure is what I'm talking about. To put it into a concrete example, and what I'll show with a little bit of code is like if we're gonna track books, like books maybe somebody's read or wants to read or whatever. Pretty simple example here, but to code it pretty quickly, I kept it simple. But like our database would be the book tracker. Maybe that's what we call it. The database is the book tracker. The collection is all the books that are being tracked. And then those books are a bunch of different documents for each book. And the information that we can access as a client, well, I shouldn't say client, we can say client as like a browser or whatever, but like as a human per se, if this is a web application, or what I will be able to see is the title, author, rating. But what is stored in MongoDB in addition to title, author, and rating is also what we just discussed with that object ID, to keep it a unique entry that doesn't get confused with anything else. So for example here, our JSON schema in MongoDB, each document looks like this, where we've got the curly brackets. The first thing is an object ID, and then it's whatever else you want for that collection. So for example, this top one, we've got title, author, rating. We also could have genre, we could have pages, we could have date created, date added, date deleted, right? We could have all these different things. And that's the cool part about MongoDB, is that like it's not set in stone. And we could have a bunch of different information about our books. So if we look down here, I added screenshots like I did to the rest of the video presentation. I just took a screenshot of a few entries I added to, this is MongoDB, this is the Compass GUI that I used last week, and I was trying it out on some mock data here. Didn't make these documents too complicated for the sake of a short code demonstration. But I wanted to show you that, this is what the documents look like in their interface. And so I kept it simple with title, author, rating, but you can also see in red we have that object ID. And you can kind of just quickly glance over these 5 and see that, oh yeah, the object ID is not the same. And so that's the information we do have, and we actually through here can add data. So that is some books that we have in that collection. Okay, so the operations that MongoDB, what we can do is we can, what we've discussed already, like the CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete. in JavaScript, we can use some built-in methods here. So we've got an insert one. We've got find if we want to look for something that's already in the list of books. Create is going to add a new book or new entry. Now, I'm using the example that I decided to contextualize all of this with, but obviously, whatever your collection is, whether it's like dog breeds, types of coffee, right? It could be like anything, and you could use this same set of operations for it. Update, update one, delete, delete one. There's also like insert many, which is actually really helpful. So you can just do that as a function in your JavaScript to add a bunch of data. And so there's a few more of those, but these are like the four big ones. Go over the web stack flow, like what we have been using in this class, and then what I'll try to demonstrate with my code in just a little bit is like, right, we've got our front end and we fetch that with the API. Express on the back end does that middleware stuff, checking stuff, etc., does its checkpoint. And then we've got like our insert one, something like into our collection of books, because our collection is named books, so insert one. And, you know, that would include all the information. This is just a simplified version. And then MongoDB does that update on the database book tracker, and then it returns that JSON information back. And for example, if we added one, it would repost it. Now I also have just a image down here. This is like technically in Mongo Compass, the collection of books. It's just this one line. I love how, you know, the simplicity of this interface. And up here, this is specifically the book tracker one. So we could have multiple collections, right? We could have users, we could have books, other sets of information, maybe like time read, I don't know. But we could have a whole bunch of collections that make up the book tracker, different things we want to track with different data and different information, and we can just create the collection here. So that's what that sort of interface looks like. So that's showing us the collection. And lastly, before we really look at some code and try to add and update some books and whatnot, some of the advantages to MongoDB is the schema list part of it, adding and removing fields easily as your app grows. I think this is a huge advantage. It's super cool that we can do this and be like, okay, actually, let's add pages in, or let's add genre, or whatever. The fact that the JSON format matches JavaScript objects is pretty cool. And this allows for it to be more scalable. That's the goal. Faster development. I mean, I learned a lot about this app pretty quickly in the last couple weeks, which feels awesome. And the working with Node and Express and some of these other things makes it really flexible to work with. So just to bring it back around and compare it to a MySQL, I guess specifically is the one I put in, but a lot of the things, there's a lot of different types of SQL databases, or like relational databases, but so these things are true for most of them. You know, MongoDB is like one of the outliers with a lot of clear differences. So anyway, so thinking about sort of MySQL or SQL based, it's a relational model. It uses tables, rows, and columns. Different from MongoDB in that we've talked about the document based model using collections and documents rather than tables, rows, and columns. MySQL uses SQL. You have to join relationships, so join tables in order to get information from those joint tables. You don't have to do that in MongoDB. Instead of using a language called SQL, you use Mongo query language. The schema is flexible, and you don't need to do those joins if you're doing a query. So it's already all in one place and accessible in that way. MySQL scales vertically, whereas MongoDB scales horizontally. And MySQL, I'm not trying to say that there's no purpose or place for it, but it's super structured, and my understanding for things that need less flexibility, or things like finance or data that needs a lot of more security, um, and there's more constants involved, MySQL is a better choice. Whereas MongoDB, um, it scales more easily, it's more flexible, fast changing, good for like web apps and APIs. All right, let's do a code demo and try to connect to a book tracker database. All right, let's do a short code demo here. So to be able to kind of demo what I wanted, I already did a JavaScript document to connect the MongoDB database or the Mongo client, and I started this. So I'm going to add on to it. I hope that's okay. I was videoing working on this before, but of course ran into some problems that lasted longer than the 5 minutes. So, and of course it was an issue in here of needing to have type equal module. So that's our ES6 modules for JavaScript. Anyway, so up here we are importing the connectDB function from the connect.js file to connect our database here. And then I started writing our function to run our database, and down here we are calling it. So the first thing here that this is all in conjunction with what I was talking about before, with having a database called Book Tracker, having a collection called books, and then being able to create, read, update, and delete different books in the database. So from the image before, I think I showed you 4 or 5 documents in our Book Tracker database. And so I wrote this up, and I wanted to first see what we have in there. So I did read here a variable for all books, and then we're finding them, we're calling to array, and then it is printing to the console books in the database. Let's add a colon there, all books. So let's see what we get here. Okay, awesome. So we're in the file name, and what you can see is books in the database. Let me make sure to save that. Books in the database. And then we've got the documents, and so it's actually showing us here the components that are for the user, but also the object ID, which is all different for all of them because they're all different documents in the collection of books. So we got Dune, Pride, Prejudice, etc., etc. So let's see what we can do with those here. So we did read. I want to also show how we can write some stuff to add another. So we want to do create here. Let's do create. I'm just going to label it so I keep track of what I'm doing. Okay, let's add a create. We do want to do, let's see, create, and we can use what we were talking about before, like books. Books is our collection, and then we can do insert. Let's do insert one, if I remember. Insert one. Okay, yep, document. And then we put our schema in here, which is basically like our components of our document. So we know that if we look down here, I don't need to do the object ID, it automatically does that, but we need title, author, rating, whatever we'd rate it, and this is our parenthesis here. Okay, we're going to need a colon, I think. Okay, so let's see. What do we want to put in here? Lord of the Rings, maybe? I definitely added a bunch of classics, so let's just stick with it. Okay, Lord of the Rings, author J.R.R. I mean, I guess it doesn't really matter. Just showing you kind of how it works. And then let's rate it. Let's give it a 5. Why not? Okay. We've got some problems. Oh, right. We need commas. Absolutely. Okay. Comma, comma, and then let's fix that to rating. Okay, that seems pretty happy. Okay, and then we can... Let's just like... So we have console, blog. Let's do another of like added LOTR for Lord of the Rings. And then, oopsies. And then books after add LOTR, just so we can make sure it's in there. Okay, oh, yeah, and we don't want it to, let's see, oh, wait here. Okay, save, it's going to format for us. Okay, so let's see what we get now. We get anything. Okay, let's see, we've got 1, 2, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's see. This is what's going on. We're just doing this for some testing. Yep, okay. We needed a new variable to be all of our books, so all books 2. So down here, and I ran it accidentally twice, so now we've got 2 of the same book. Oopsies. So what we can do quickly, I'll do as kind of like my last thing. Let's do an update really quick. Although, yeah, let's do an update, but then we're going to add another. I mean, that's okay, right? That's fine. Okay, let's do an update. Or actually, let's do delete. Let's do a delete. Okay, delete. We've got to delete 1. Font like built in here. And we can say the title is Lord of the Rings. Right, Lord of the Rings. Okay, and then so this is pretty neat how it's like already built in, but we want to delete it from books. We need that out front. We also, let's see, we also want to use our await here so it doesn't promise something that doesn't actually happen. Okay, I think that's it. Okay, let's do console. log after delete. After delete. All books too. I know that's not going to work, but we're going to actually just bring this down. Let's put that there. Demand pool's got a problem. Line 23. Line 23. We've got an extras period. Save. Okay, I'm almost done here. So sorry. It's a little longer than expected. Okay, so we're going to save it. Let's go back to the terminal. Let's reconnect. Let's see. Oopsies. Oh yeah, what did I do? Getting ahead of myself. I apologize. We're going to put this here. We're going to get rid of these. We're going to save it. Let's see. We've got lots of Lord of the Rings now. Lord of the Rings. Now, Lord. Oh, I called it Lord of Rings this whole time. Oops. Guess I'm nervous or something. Okay, let's try it one more time and see if what happens. Lord of Rings. Lord of Rings. We got 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Let's see. Await books, delete 1. Wonder if there's, I'm looking at a delete many. Let's try that. There we go. Okay, delete many. So that allowed us to delete, look at that. Okay, we had a bunch of Lord of the Rings, and now we have none. And quickly, I'm sorry this is so long. You don't have to watch all of it. Delete, and then let's just do an update really quick, because the update is pretty cool. Okay, so await, we need books, update. I wonder if we can update, probably can update many as I'm messing with this, but let's do update 1, and let's do title. Let's update 1984, because hopefully I can't goof up the name of that one, right? Pretty simple. Okay, but let's update the rating, because we have it at 4. Let's just set it to 5, but we need to set it like that. Set. We've got too many of these. Here. Okay, set. La la la. This is too many here. Okay, set it to 5. Always need our semicolon. Okay, that isn't screaming at me. Okay, then console. Updated 1984 rating. Okay, now this isn't the best way to test things, but this is what we're just doing right now with the few minutes that we have. Okay, so we got delete many, and then we've got after updates. And let's see. Let's see here how this works. Okay. Nice. Okay, you can see that 1984 has updated to 5. Awesome. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, thank you so much. So sorry that took a little bit longer than planned.